The first snow of 1882 had not yet fallen when the sheriff's deputy rode up to Stella Archer's door and told her she had until sundown to collect her things and leave. Stella stood in the doorway of the small homestead she had shared with her husband Thomas for 6 years, her hand pressed flat against the doorframe as though she could hold the house in place through sheer will. The deputy, a young man named Cord who could not have been more than 22, had the decency to look at his boots when he delivered the news. He held a folded paper in his gloved hand and extended it toward her with the stiff formality of someone who understood he was doing something wicked but had been told it was legal. "I am sorry, Mrs. Archer," Cord said. "Mr. Holt has the deed. It was settled at the county office 3 weeks ago. There was an outstanding debt on the property, and Mr. Holt purchased it fair and square, according to the law." Stella did not take the paper. She looked past the deputy's shoulder at the flat, gray sky pressing down over the Kansas plains, and she thought about Thomas, who had been dead 8 months now from a fever that moved through him faster than any doctor could follow. She thought about the loan Thomas had taken out from Emmett Holt the previous spring to buy seed and additional cattle. She had known about the loan. She had not known the property itself was the collateral. "Fair and square," she said quietly, and the words tasted like dust. She packed what she could into 2 large trunks and a canvas sack. She took the photograph of Thomas from above the fireplace, the iron cookware, the quilts her mother had sewn, and her daughter Clara's small collection of carved wooden animals that Thomas had made on winter evenings. Clara was 7 years old and stood beside her mother in the yard, watching the deputy nail a notice to the door post with 3 sharp blows of his hammer. Clara said nothing. She had learned, in the months since her father's death, to go very quiet when the world pressed in on her. The temperature dropped steadily through the afternoon. By the time the last pale light was draining from the western sky, the wind had sharpened into something that cut through wool and cotton alike. Stella had loaded the 2 trunks into the wagon and hitched their remaining horse, an aging roan mare named June, to the traces. She drove away from the house without looking back, because she understood that looking back would break something inside her that could not be mended. She had no family within 300 miles. The nearest town, Caldwell, was 12 miles south, and she had perhaps $4 in coin tucked into the toe of her spare boot. She drove toward the road that ran between Caldwell and the outlying homesteads, trying to think clearly through the rising cold, trying to remember who on these plains might take in a widow and her child on a winter evening with no arrangement made in advance. It was Clara who spotted the light first. "Mama," the child said, pulling on Stella's sleeve. "There is a lamp burning over that hill." Stella followed her daughter's pointing finger toward a low rise to the east, where a warm yellow light glowed faintly through the darkening air. She knew that property, the Sawyer ranch. She had passed it dozens of times on the road to town but had never stopped, never had occasion to. Paul Sawyer was a name she knew only in the way one knows the names of all the ranchers within a certain radius. A tall man she had seen twice at the general store and once at the church social in the spring, though he had not stayed long. He had a reputation for keeping to himself, for running a clean operation, and for being, as old Mrs. Petrie at the Mercantile once said, quieter than a shadow at noon. Stella almost did not turn the wagon. She sat for a long moment in the darkening cold with Clara pressed against her side and the wind pushing hard against them both, and she thought about the dignity of a woman who did not go begging. Then Clara's small hand found hers and squeezed, and Stella turned the wagon east toward the light. The Sawyer ranch was larger than she had imagined from the road. The main house was a solid 2-story structure of milled timber, with a covered porch running along the front and a stone chimney, throwing a steady column of smoke against the dark sky. A large barn stood 40 yards behind it, and there were several smaller outbuildings. She could hear cattle somewhere in the dark, a low, patient sound that meant they were sheltered and settled for the night. Someone here was competent. Someone here had prepared for winter. She pulled June to a stop at the gate and sat for a moment, gathering herself. Then she climbed down from the wagon, lifted Clara down beside her, and walked up the porch steps. She knocked 3 times. The door opened almost immediately, as though the man inside had heard the wagon coming up the road. Paul Sawyer filled the doorway in the way large men do, not aggressively but simply through the fact of their physical presence. He was perhaps 34 or 35, with dark hair gone slightly gray at the temples, a jaw shadowed with several days of beard, and eyes the color of good dark timber, brown shot through with something quiet and watchful. He was wearing his work clothes, a heavy flannel shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had seen considerable use. He looked at Stella and then down at Clara and then back at Stella with an expression that moved quickly through surprise and settled into something calm and attentive. "Mrs. Archer," he said. She was startled that he knew her name. "Mr. Sawyer," she said. "I apologize for the hour. I would not have come if I had any other." She stopped herself, because she had promised she would not ramble or apologize more than once. "Emmett Holt took my property today. The deputy served me notice this afternoon. I have nowhere to go tonight and I have my daughter with me and the cold is coming on hard." Paul Sawyer looked at her for 3 full seconds, and in those seconds Stella held herself very straight and looked back at him steadily, because she was a woman who had buried her husband and packed her house into a wagon in a single afternoon and driven into the dark, and she was not going to look away from a man's eyes simply because she was asking for help. "Come inside," he said, and stepped back from the door. The warmth of the house came over them like a physical thing. Clara made a small, involuntary sound and pressed closer to her mother's side. The front room was large and plainly furnished, a stone fireplace burning well on the far wall, a heavy oak table, 4 chairs, a worn settee and bookshelves that held more volumes than Stella had expected. The room was clean in the unsentimental way of a house kept by a working man who had no patience for disorder but no particular interest in decoration either. "Sit down," Paul said, moving to the fireplace to add another log. "I will put coffee on. Have you eaten?" "We have not," Stella admitted. He nodded once, went to the kitchen, and she heard him moving with the economy of a man who cooked for himself and did not waste motions doing it. Clara stood beside Stella and looked at the bookshelves with open curiosity. One of the carved wooden animals had made it into the child's coat pocket, a small horse, and she held it in her hand. Stella sat down on the settee and felt the warmth beginning to unclench the cold that had settled into her shoulders and chest. The room smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something underneath that, something that was simply the lived-in smell of a man's house, leather and wool, and the faint sweetness of hay. Paul came back through the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee and a smaller cup of warm milk for Clara. He set them on the table and pulled a chair out for Stella and a second one beside it for the child. Then he went back to the kitchen and returned with a plate of cold biscuits and a covered pot of something that proved to be beef stew, still warm from supper. He set it all on the table without ceremony. "Eat," he said. "We can talk after." Stella almost said that she did not want to impose further, but she was hungry and Clara was hungry and the stew was there. So she sat at the table and served her daughter first and then herself. And for a few minutes the only sound in the room was the fire and the wind outside and the quiet scrape of spoons on the earthenware bowls Paul had set out. He sat at the far end of the table with his coffee and did not watch them eat, which she appreciated. He looked at the fire. She noticed that his hands, wrapped around the mug, were the hands of a man who worked with them constantly, broad across the palm, with healed-over cuts and calluses at the base of each finger. When Clara had eaten most of her stew and was blinking with exhaustion, Paul stood without being asked and said, "There is a guest room at the top of the stairs. The bed is made up. The child looks like she needs to sleep." "She does," Stella said. "Mr. Sawyer, I want to be clear about what I am asking. I am asking only for shelter tonight. Tomorrow I will drive to Caldwell and make other arrangements." He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "Tonight is below freezing," he said. "You are not sleeping outside. Neither is your daughter." He paused. "We can discuss arrangements tomorrow, as you say. For now there is a room upstairs and it is yours." He showed them up the stairs himself, carrying Clara, who had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder in the last 5 minutes. He carried the child with easy, practiced care, the way a man carries something he does not want to disturb, and laid her on the bed in the guest room without waking her. Stella pulled off the child's boots and drew the quilt up to her chin. She stood looking at her sleeping daughter for a moment. "Thank you," she said quietly when they were back in the hallway. "It is nothing," Paul said, which she understood he meant literally, not as a dismissal. "There are extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed if you need them. The cold will be worse before morning." She went back downstairs with him. The fire had settled into a deep, steady burn. She sat in one of the chairs near the hearth because she did not yet feel equal to going upstairs and lying in the dark with her thoughts, and he seemed to sense this because he sat down too in the chair across from hers and poured himself a second cup of coffee from the pot he had moved to the hearth. "How did Holt do it?" he asked, not unkindly, just directly. "Thomas borrowed against the property for the spring planting," she said. "I knew about the loan. I did not know the property was the security. Or perhaps I knew and did not understand what it meant." She looked at her hands. "Thomas died before the debt could be paid, and Holt acquired the deed through the county office." "When did you find out?" "Today, when the deputy came." Paul was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind made a long, searching sound along the eaves. "Holt has been acquiring land that way for 4 years," he said. "He is not the only one doing it. There are men all through this territory who make a practice of lending to struggling homesteaders and then waiting." "I know," Stella said. "I know that now." "I am sorry about your husband," he said. "Thomas Archer was a decent man. I bought a horse from him once, 3 years ago. He gave me a fair price, and the horse was exactly what he said it was." Something about the plainness of this tribute caught in her chest. "Yes," she said. "He was exactly what he said he was." They sat in silence for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. The fire was warm and the house was solid, and the wind was outside where it belonged. Eventually, Paul said he was going to check on the animals before he turned in, and she said good night and went upstairs. She lay in the guest room for a long time, listening to the wind and looking at the dark ceiling before she finally slept. Morning came pale and hard with frost feathering the windows. Stella woke before Clara and went quietly downstairs to find that Paul had already been up for some time. The kitchen fire was lit, coffee was made, and she could see him through the window moving between the barn and the house in the early gray light, carrying something on his shoulder. She put on her coat and boots and went to help, because she had not spent 6 years on a homestead without learning that morning work does not wait on courtesy. He was surprised to see her come around the corner of the barn, but he only said, "Morning," and handed her a second pail without discussion, and they fed the animals together in the steady, companionable way of people who understand work. The cattle were a good quality herd, 32 head of mixed Longhorn and Hereford. There were also 6 horses in the stable, all of them well kept, and a pair of working dogs who regarded Stella with polite suspicion, before deciding she was acceptable. Paul's hired man, a weathered older gentleman named Samuel who had apparently worked on the ranch for over a decade, arrived from the small bunkhouse just as they were finishing, and greeted Stella with a courteous tip of his hat. Over breakfast, which Paul cooked without comment and which Clara ate with the enthusiasm of a child who had recovered her equilibrium overnight, the conversation turned practical. Stella laid out her situation plainly: $4, a wagon, a horse, 2 trunks, a 7-year-old daughter, and no family within traveling distance. She had skills. She could cook, sew, manage a household, tend livestock, and she had kept the books for the homestead, which meant she could figure and keep accounts. Paul listened to all of this with his coffee cup held in both hands. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I need a housekeeper," he said. "I have needed one for 2 years, and I have not found a suitable arrangement. The work is real work: cooking, cleaning, managing the household stores, keeping the accounts for the ranch. Samuel can help with the outdoor work when you need it. I cannot pay a great wage, but I can pay something, and there is the room upstairs for you and Clara and meals and a warm house." Stella looked at him across the table. "That is a generous offer," she said carefully, "but I want to understand it clearly. You are offering employment." "Yes," he said, "employment, with a room included as part of the arrangement. Nothing more complicated than that." She thought about it for the length of time it took Clara to finish her last biscuit and asked if she could go look at the horses. Paul said she could and watched the child trot toward the door with a brief expression that was difficult to read. When Clara was gone, clattering down the porch steps with her wooden horse in her hand, Stella said, "All right, I accept." He nodded. "Good." It was a businesslike beginning. But beginnings, Stella was learning, had very little to do with what things eventually became. The first week was one of careful adjustment. Stella learned the geography of the house, which was larger than it looked from the outside. The front room, the kitchen with its good iron stove, a small study off the kitchen where Paul kept his ranch ledgers, and a desk stacked with correspondence. 3 rooms upstairs, of which she and Clara occupied one and Paul occupied another. She learned the rhythms of the household, when Paul rose and when he came in from the range, what he ate and what he did not, how he took his coffee, and what hours he spent in the study going over figures. He was a man of considerable discipline and not many words. He said what he meant and did not say what he did not mean. He was not cold, but he was contained, and Stella recognized in him something she had seen in herself since Thomas's death. The quality of a person who has learned to keep their inner life behind a wall because the world on the outside requires too much attention to allow for much display. Clara adapted to the ranch with the resilience that children seem to manufacture from thin air. She followed Samuel around the yard with solemn curiosity, and peppered him with questions about the cattle and the horses and the dogs. And Samuel, who had grandchildren of his own in Missouri whom he saw twice a year, answered every question with patient good humor. Within a week she had named both dogs, the larger one Walter and the smaller one Midge, names that Samuel adopted without comment and which stuck for the remainder of their lives. Paul did not talk much to Clara at first, not out of unkindness, but out of what appeared to be a genuine uncertainty about how to address children. He was courteous and careful around her, the way a man is around something he values but does not yet know how to handle. Stella watched this and said nothing. She was watching a great many things. What she noticed in those first weeks: Paul read in the evenings, usually history or natural science, and occasionally he would read aloud a passage that struck him, apparently to no one in particular, simply because he liked the words. He treated Samuel with the respect due a partner rather than an employee. He was, she realized slowly, a man without much loneliness in him, not because he had been spared it, but because he had made a kind of peace with solitude that had become indistinguishable from contentment. At least that was how it appeared from the outside. She began keeping the household accounts the second week, taking over the ledger book in which Paul had been making notations that were accurate but minimally organized. She restructured the pages, added columns for livestock expenses and supply costs and seasonal projections, and left the ledger on the desk with a brief note explaining the new system. She did not make a point of it. He came to find her in the kitchen that evening, holding the ledger book open to the supply page. "This is your work." He said, "I reorganized the columns. If you prefer the old method, I can put it back." "No," he said, turning the page. "This is better." He looked up at her. "Thomas said you kept the books." "He did not like figures," she said. "I do." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite name. "Did you go to school?" he asked. "Until I was 16. My father was a schoolteacher in Ohio. He believed in education for women as strongly as for men." Something shifted slightly in Paul's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition, as though she had said something that sorted a puzzle piece into place. "Good," he said. which again she understood was his way of saying something was more than adequate. He took the ledger back to the study, and she heard him moving through it for an hour. The social situation on the plains was, as Stella was well aware, not uncomplicated. A widow living under a single man's roof, even as an employee with a child in the house as natural chaperone, was the kind of arrangement that set tongues moving. She discovered this when she drove the wagon into Caldwell 3 weeks after arriving at the Sawyer ranch, intending to pick up household supplies. At the general store, Mrs. Petrie waited until Stella had given her list to the counter clerk before leaning across and saying, in the particular tone of a woman who believes she is being helpful, "It is none of my affair, of course, but people do talk, Mrs. Archer. A woman alone in that house. Some might wonder at your situation." Stella looked at Mrs. Petrie steadily and said, "My situation is that I am the housekeeper at the Sawyer ranch and my daughter and I have a comfortable room there. If people would like to discuss that, I expect they will find it very poor entertainment." She picked up her list and turned back to the counter. But Mrs. Petrie's comment had planted something that stayed with her on the drive back to the ranch. The long, flat road unrolling through the brown winter grass, the sky above vast and pale. She thought about what she was, and what she appeared to be, and what the difference between those two things cost a woman in a small community. She thought about propriety not as a personal vanity but as a practical protection for herself, for Clara, for the position she had somehow managed to secure. She thought about Paul Sawyer, who had opened his door without hesitation and asked no questions about repayment. She thought about the way he had carried Clara up the stairs that first night, the careful, silent competence of it. She was still thinking about these things when she pulled through the ranch gate and saw Paul standing on the porch, and he raised a hand in greeting, and the small, ordinary gesture of it went through her chest like a warm current. She did not examine this too closely. She was not ready to examine it. December deepened. Snow came in mid-month, a serious storm that put down 8 inches over 3 days and drove the temperature low enough that the water in the outdoor trough needed breaking every morning. Paul and Samuel kept the livestock sheltered and fed through the worst of it. Stella kept the house, and it was during those snowbound days that the shape of their shared life began to acquire texture and substance that neither of them had anticipated. Clara caught a cold during the storm, a rattling chest cold that left her feverish for 4 days. Stella sat with her through the nights, keeping the fire in the upstairs grate fed and the child's forehead cool with damp cloths. On the second night past midnight, she came downstairs to get more water and found Paul sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp and a book, which he closed when she came in. "How is she?" he asked. "Better than last night. The fever is lower." Stella filled the basin from the water bucket. "You do not need to sit up." "I am not sleeping anyway," he said simply. She looked at him. "Clara has been keeping you awake." "No," he said. He picked up his book and then put it down again. "I thought you might need something." She stood at the kitchen table with the basin in her hands and looked at this man who had been a stranger to her 6 weeks ago, who was not a stranger now, and felt the careful wall she kept around her inner life develop what she could only describe as a hairline crack. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and picked his book back up, and she took the basin upstairs, and nothing more was said about it. But the next afternoon, when Clara's fever finally broke for good, and the child sat up in bed and asked for biscuits and where was Walter, Paul appeared in the bedroom doorway with a plate of biscuits and a look of such transparent relief that Stella had to turn away and find something to do with her hands at the window. Christmas came quietly. Stella roasted a chicken and made 2 pies, a pecan and an apple, from stores in the root cellar, and Samuel joined them for the meal, and Paul produced from somewhere a small toy horse carved from white birchwood and left it at Clara's place at the table. Clara's face when she found it was the face of a child experiencing genuine joy, and she held the white horse and the brown horse her father had made together in both hands and looked at Paul with eyes that held everything she felt but could not say. Paul looked back at her with an expression that was, Stella thought, very close to undone. "My father used to make them," he said, a little gruffly. "It is not difficult. If you like, I can show you how." Clara nodded so vigorously her braids bounced. After the meal, when Samuel had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Clara was asleep on the settee with both horses tucked under her chin, Stella and Paul sat by the fire with the last of the coffee and talked for 3 hours. Not about the ranch or the household or practical things. They talked about where they had come from. Paul was from Indiana originally, had come west at 20 following an older brother who had since returned east and taken a banker's position, and written twice a year with letters that Paul read and answered and put away in a drawer. He had built the ranch from a land claim, had broken the first ground himself, had lost 2 years to drought and recovered. He had been married once, briefly, a woman named Ellen who had come with him from Indiana and found, after one winter, that she could not make a home on the plains. She had gone back to her family in 1875. There were no children. He said this without visible pain, only with the flat accuracy of a man describing something that had happened and been absorbed. Stella told him about Ohio, about her schoolteacher father and her mother who had taught her to cook and sew with equal seriousness, about coming west at 19 with Thomas, who had been her neighbor's son and her childhood companion, and the only man she had ever considered marrying. About the 6 years of the homestead, the good years and the hard years, and the last terrible year of Thomas's illness. She had not talked about any of this at length to anyone since his death. She found that it came more easily than she expected, sitting in the warm room with the fire steady, and the snow quiet outside and Paul listening with the focused attention of a man who did not perform interest but simply had it. When she finally stopped talking, she realized the fire had burned down considerably and the room was dim. "I should let you sleep," she said. "Yes," he said, but neither of them moved immediately. The fire made small sounds. Outside, one of the horses shifted in the barn. A distant sound carried through the still cold air. "This has been a good Christmas," Paul said. He said it quietly, as though he were making a note to himself rather than speaking to her. "Yes," she said. "It has." She went upstairs, and she lay in the dark for a long time, and she thought about Thomas with love and grief that had become over these months something more bearable, something she could carry without being bent by it. And she thought about Paul Sawyer, and what it meant that sitting in a room with him for 3 hours felt like the most comfortable she had been in over a year. January was the hardest month. The cold became serious and sustained, the kind of cold that killed cattle if you were not vigilant and cracked the skin of your hands if you worked outside too long. Paul and Samuel were out on the range every day in the worst of it, checking the herd, breaking ice, bringing in any animal that showed signs of distress. Stella ran the house with efficient competence, keeping the larder managed and the fires fed and the accounts current, and she began, with Paul's knowledge, to take on some correspondence with suppliers and buyers that freed him from desk work he found tedious. She wrote letters in his name, drafting them in the study late in the evenings after Clara was in bed, and she discovered that she could read his intentions from the terse notes he left her and translate them into correspondence that was effective and precise. He began leaving longer notes, more specific ones, trusting her judgment in the phrasing. Once he read a letter she had written to a cattle buyer in Wichita and said, "That is better than anything I would have written." "You would have gotten the point across," she said. "Not as efficiently," he said. He looked at the letter again. "You have a gift for this." "My father said words were tools," she said. He was right. The first real tension between them came in late January and had nothing to do with either of them directly. A man named Roy Clement, who operated a small cattle operation north of the Sawyer ranch, rode over one afternoon while Paul was out on the range and knocked at the door. He was perhaps 40, broad-faced, and a little too well pleased with himself, and when Stella answered the door he smiled in a way that she had seen before from men who believed a woman alone was an opportunity. I heard Paul Sawyer had himself a housekeeper, Clement said, his eyes moving over her in a way that was not respectful. I thought I would come introduce myself. Mr. Sawyer is on the range, Stella said. I will tell him you called. No need to rush me off, Clement said, putting one hand on the doorframe. I have been meaning to introduce myself for weeks, Roy Clement, and you would be the widow Archer. I would, she said. Goodbye, Mr. Clement. She closed the door. She stood inside the closed door for a moment, her heart moving faster than she liked, and then she went back to the account she had been working on and did not think about it further until Paul came in that evening. She told him about Clement the way she told him most things, directly and without decoration. Paul's expression as she spoke did not change much, but something behind his eyes went very quiet in a way she had come to recognize as his version of serious displeasure. Clement has that reputation, he said. I handled it, she said. I know you did, he said. I am not suggesting otherwise, he paused. If he comes again, send Samuel for me. Not because you need my assistance, but because there are some men who respond better to a conversation with another man, and Clement is one of them. That is a reasonable position, she said. And also, Paul said, not looking at her, looking instead at the fire, I do not want him coming to this house with that manner. She understood that the second reason was different from the first reason, and she filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things she was not yet ready to examine. Clement did not come again. Word apparently traveled because 2 weeks later at the general store in Caldwell, Samuel mentioned that Clement had been seen at the county office asking about Stella's status and had been told, by sources Samuel declined to specify, that she was under the Sawyer household's protection in every sense of the word. Samuel reported this with neutral satisfaction. Who told him that? Stella asked. I may have said something to that effect to a few of the hands at the stockyard, Samuel said, and would not elaborate further. February brought a brief thaw, 3 days of relative warmth that turned the yard to mud and made everyone feel the winter was not permanent after all. On the first of those warm days, Paul suggested, in a casual way that she had come to understand, meant he had been thinking about it for some time, that Clara might like to learn to ride properly. Clara received this suggestion with the controlled excitement of a child trying very hard to seem composed, which was to say her eyes became enormous, and she said, Yes, please, Mr. Sawyer, in a voice that nearly vibrated. The riding lessons took place in the yard each afternoon when the light was good. Paul was a patient teacher. He was methodical and clear, explaining each step before asking Clara to attempt it, never showing impatience when she made the same mistake more than once. Stella watched from the porch sometimes, and once from the barn door. And what she was watching was not only her daughter learning to ride, but Paul learning how to be easy with a child, the gradual relaxation of a guarded person into something more open. On the 4th day of lessons, Clara managed a proper walk and then a slow trot around the yard without losing her position, and when she pulled the mare to a stop, she turned and looked at Paul with the absolute trusting radiance of a child who has just done something she thought she could not do and knows exactly whose instruction made it possible. Paul's face in that moment was something Stella would carry with her for the rest of her life. That evening after supper, Paul told Stella, with the careful understatement she had come to know well, that Clara was a natural rider and would be capable of managing a horse on her own within a few months. She loves it, Stella said. She loved it from the first day. She is brave, he said, not reckless, brave, there is a difference. Her father was the same way, Stella said, and the mention of Thomas was easy and unguarded in a way it had not been at the beginning. Paul looked at her across the table. She looks like you, he said, but she has his manner, the way she listens to something and then does it. Yes, Stella said. Yes, that is exactly Thomas. They looked at each other for a moment, and the ease of it, the simple fact of 2 people sitting at a table talking about a child they both had come to care about, was so comfortable and so natural that Stella felt the hairline crack in her wall widen considerably. She dreamed about Paul that night for the first time. She woke before dawn and lay very still, and acknowledged to herself, in the honest way she tried to acknowledge all things, that what she felt for Paul Sawyer had moved some time ago beyond gratitude and respect and into territory that was warmer and less simple. She did not know what to do with this. She was a widow not yet a year out of mourning, a woman in a man's household in an employment arrangement, and propriety and good sense both suggested a great deal of caution. But she also knew herself to be a practical woman, and practical women, she had found, could not sustain self-deception for very long. The question was what Paul felt. He was so contained, so careful. She could read him better now than she had in December, but there were still rooms in him she had not seen into. The answer came in March, in an indirect way. Emmett Holt rode onto the ranch on a Wednesday morning when Paul was in the south pasture. Stella was hanging wash on the line by the side of the house, and she heard the horse coming up the road and came around the corner to see Holt dismounting at the gate. He was a thick-set man of 50 with a prosperous look to his clothes and a comfortable certainty in his manner that she found immediately repellent. He saw her and came through the gate with a wide smile. "Mrs. Archer," he said, "I heard you had landed on your feet." Stella set down her basket and looked at him. "Mr. Holt." "I have been meaning to stop by," he said. "I wanted to explain the business with your property. There was nothing personal in it. The law is the law." "I am aware of the law," she said. "Thomas was a good man," Holt said, in the tone of a man who uses the dead as soft furniture to sit on. "I had real respect for him, which is why I wanted to make sure you knew there were no hard feelings on my part." "That is very generous," Stella said, in a tone that made it clear she meant nothing of the kind. Holt's smile did not waver. "I also wanted you to know that if you ever need anything, assistance with your circumstances, well, I am a man of some means. I could make things considerably easier for a woman in your position." She understood perfectly what he was suggesting, and the understanding produced in her a cold, clear anger that she kept entirely off her face. "I have everything I need, thank you," she said. "Good day, Mr. Holt." He was still talking when Paul came around the far side of the barn with Samuel behind him, having apparently seen the unfamiliar horse at the gate from the pasture. Paul took in Stella's expression and Holt's position in one glance, and whatever he read in those two things made his jaw go tight. "Holt," he said. Holt turned. "Sawyer, I was just paying a social call on your housekeeper." "You were leaving," Paul said, in a voice that was completely even and entirely unambiguous. Holt looked between them. The comfortable certainty in his manner was still there, but it had shifted into something calculating. "No need for unfriendliness," he said. "I was merely—" "You were leaving," Paul said again. He did not step forward. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood in the yard with his hands at his sides and looked at Holt with an expression that had no violence in it and no particular emotion, only the absolute fact of his intention. Holt left. After the sound of hoofbeats had faded down the road, Stella let out a breath she had not fully realized she was holding. Samuel disappeared around the back of the barn with the tact of a man who had worked for Paul Sawyer for a decade and knew when to be elsewhere. Stella and Paul stood in the yard. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "He was unpleasant but not dangerous." "What did he say to you?" she told him, accurately and without dramatizing it. Paul listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and the quietness had a particular quality. "He will not come here again," Paul said. "You do not need to." "I know I do not need to," he said. "I want to." He stopped. He looked at her with those dark eyes that she had learned to read at least partially. "Stella," he said, and the use of her first name, which he had not used before, landed quietly between them. "I want to make sure you are safe here, not because it is my obligation as your employer, for other reasons." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something complex. "What other reasons?" she asked. He was quiet for a full 5 seconds. A hawk turned high overhead. The March wind moved through the dry grass. "I think you know what other reasons," he said. She did know. She had known for some time. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." They stood in the yard looking at each other, and it was one of those moments that seems very still on the outside while enormous things shift within it. "I do not want to make you uncomfortable in your own home," he said carefully, "or in your situation. You are in my employment and you came to me because you had no other option, and I am aware that those are circumstances that can." "Paul," she said. He stopped. "I'm a practical woman. I know my own mind." She paused. "I'm not yet a full year from Thomas's death. I think there is a rightness in taking time." "Yes," he said immediately, "but I am not unaware of what I feel," she said. "I simply think it deserves care." "It does," he said. "I agree with that." He held her gaze. "I am a patient man." "I know," she said. "That is one of the things I have noticed." He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him in weeks. A brief, genuine lifting at the corners of his mouth that he seemed not to know how to sustain, but which, while it lasted, changed his face into something she had no good word for except warm. She picked up her wash basket and went back to the clothesline, and he went back to whatever he had been doing in the south pasture, and that was all. But something had been opened and named, and neither of them could close it again, nor did they try. Spring came slowly to the Kansas plains, the way it always did, grudgingly and in fits and starts, a warm week followed by a cold snap, mud and then green shoots and then another frost. The ranch stirred with the energy of the season, calves being born, repairs to be made after winter, seed orders and fence work, and all the sustained activity that a working cattle operation required. Stella and Paul moved through the days in a way that had changed subtly in tone while remaining outwardly the same. They worked side by side, talked in the evenings, read in the same room. He showed her the range accounts in detail and asked her opinion on the summer cattle sale pricing, and she realized he was not asking to be polite, but because he genuinely valued what she thought. She revised the supply orders for the spring and summer based on the previous 3 years' records, and he looked over her projections and said they were solid. The change between them was in small things. The way he made sure there was always coffee ready when she came downstairs. The way she set aside the particular passages in the history books that she thought he would like to discuss. The way they sat closer to each other in the evenings than they had in January. The way he sometimes simply looked at her, with a directness that was not uncomfortable but was unmistakable. Clara was not oblivious to any of this. Children rarely are. She had, in the way of children, developed an uncomplicated fondness for Paul that she expressed by saving interesting rocks and beetles to show him, and by insisting he be the one to read aloud from the adventure stories she liked in the evenings. Because, she explained to her mother with perfect logic, his voice was better for the exciting parts. Paul read the adventure stories with the careful seriousness he brought to everything, and the three of them sat in the lamplight in the front room, and it was a good life. It was, Stella thought, a better life than she had felt she deserved in those first dark weeks after Thomas's death. She still grieved Thomas. She thought this was important to say honestly. She still missed him, the specific shape of him, his laugh, the way he worried with his hands when something troubled him, the 6 years of a life built together. She did not think loving Paul would erase any of that. She was not the sort of woman who believed the heart had a limited capacity, that loving one thing required emptying it of another. Her father had taught her otherwise. In April, a neighbor woman named Ruth Haverford came to call, a kind-faced woman of 45 who had homesteaded with her husband 15 miles north, and who made it her business to know the women of the region the way some women know the weather, as a practical necessity of life. She had coffee with Stella in the kitchen while Paul was on the range, and she said, without any of Mrs. Petrie's implied judgment, "You look well, Stella. Better than when you first came through Caldwell last fall." "I am well," Stella said. Ruth looked at her with the honest, seeing eyes of a woman who had been around long enough to know what she was looking at. "Sawyer is a good man," she said. "There are not so many of them that you should ignore it when you find one." "No," Stella said. "I am aware of that." Ruth nodded and said nothing more on the subject, and they talked about the spring planting and Clara's writing lessons and the possibility of a new school being established near Caldwell, and the visit was pleasant and comfortable and left Stella feeling both seen and settled. May arrived warm and full of light. The prairie grass came back green, and the cattle ranged freely, and the days grew long enough to get a real day's work done and still have evening to spare. Paul rode the range from sunup until late afternoon most days, and Stella managed the house and the correspondence and the accounts, and in the evenings they cooked together, which had evolved naturally over the months from her cooking and him eating to a shared activity that both of them seemed to prefer. It was a warm evening in late May, with the windows open to catch the breeze and the smell of the prairie coming in with the last of the golden light, that Paul said, while they were washing up after supper, "I have been thinking about asking you something." Clara was in the yard with the dogs, visible through the window. Stella set a dish on the shelf and turned to look at him. He was standing at the wash basin with a dish towel in one hand and a look on his face that she had never quite seen before, something carefully maintained and underneath it something that was not calm at all. "What would you like to ask?" she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. He said it directly, the way he said everything without preamble or excessive flourish, but in his voice there was something so entirely genuine and unguarded that it was, she thought, the most eloquent proposal she could have imagined from him. He looked at her steadily. "I have been wanting to say it for months, and I have been waiting for the right time. I'm not entirely sure this is the right time, but I am also aware that waiting further is." He stopped himself. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you, and I love Clara and what we have here, and I would like it to be permanent, if you are willing." She had known this was coming. She had known it for some time. But hearing it said aloud in his quiet and entirely serious voice, in the kitchen where they had eaten 100 meals and talked 100 evenings, was different from anticipating it. It went through her with a warmth and a certainty that she recognized as the feeling of a right thing. "I am willing," she said. He looked at her, and the thing behind his eyes that was not calm became something that was, and it was extraordinary to watch. He came around the wash basin and stood in front of her, and he took her face in his hands, very carefully, with the same care he had carried Clara up the stairs on the first night, and he kissed her. It was a gentle, unhurried kiss, and it tasted like a promise being made. When they separated, she laughed a little, not from nervousness but from a pure, uncomplicated happiness that she had not felt for a long time. "We should tell Clara," she said. "Yes," he said. He was smiling now properly, and his whole face was different when he smiled, open in a way it usually was not, and she put her hand flat against his chest for a moment simply because she wanted to, and felt his heart moving underneath it. Clara was called in from the yard, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Stella told her that Paul had asked her to marry him, and that she had said yes. Clara looked at Paul for a long moment with a 7-year-old serious, assessing eyes. "Would you be my father?" she asked. Paul held her gaze. "If you would want that," he said, "I would be proud of it." Clara thought about this for another 3 seconds with the thoroughness of a child working through a problem of genuine importance. Then she nodded. "All right," she said, with the air of someone issuing approval. "That is good." She slid off her chair, went to Paul, and put her arms around him with the full, unself-conscious warmth of a child who had decided something and was acting on it immediately. Paul held her carefully, his large hand on the back of her small head, and over the top of her braids his eyes met Stella's, and the expression in them was something she would never fully be able to describe, except to say it was a man who had not known how much he needed something until he had it. They were married in June, at the small church in Caldwell, on a warm morning with wildflowers blooming in the grass along the road. Ruth Haverford attended, and Samuel stood up with Paul, and Clara wore a white dress that Stella had sewn from cloth bought at the mercantile, and carried a bunch of prairie flowers tied with a blue ribbon. Mrs. Petrie attended as well, and said afterward to anyone who would listen that it was a very proper and touching ceremony. apparently having revised her opinion of the whole arrangement. The Reverend Mills, who had officiated at more frontier weddings than he could count, told them afterward that he had performed the ceremony for couples who had known each other 20 years and couples who had known each other 20 days, and that what mattered was not the length of the acquaintance, but the quality of the attention two people paid each other. He said he had noticed they paid each other a great deal. Stella wore her dark blue wool dress, which was the best she owned, and Paul wore his good suit, and he looked at her at the altar with a directness that made the ceremony feel exactly right, exactly what it was, a permanent thing being made in front of witnesses. After the ceremony, there was a supper at Ruth Haverford's homestead, which Ruth had insisted on providing, and there was good food and music, and Samuel played a fiddle with considerable skill, and Clara danced until she fell asleep on a bench in the corner, and the evening was long and warm and full of the particular happiness of a celebration that has been genuinely earned. Paul and Stella drove home in the wagon under a sky full of stars, with Clara asleep in the wagon bed behind them, and the prairie all around them dark and wide and familiar. Paul drove with one hand on the reins and his other arm around Stella's shoulders, and she leaned into him, and the road home felt shorter than it ever had before. Summer on the Sawyer ranch was a full and working thing. There was the cattle sale to prepare for, which Paul and Samuel managed with Stella's logistical support, and the accounts to keep, and the household to run, and Clara to teach and oversee, and keep out of the creek in the hot afternoons when she inevitably wanted to be in it. The summer cattle sale went well, better than the previous years by a margin that Paul attributed partly to the improved record-keeping and supply management that had reduced their operating costs over the winter and spring. He said this plainly, attributing credit where it belonged, and Stella accepted it in the same spirit. They had found a way of working together that was more than the sum of its parts. Her facility with organization and correspondence and figures, combined with his knowledge of cattle and land and the practical business of ranching. And the combination was, as the improved ledgers made clear, effective. They had also found a way of being together that felt, in those summer months, like something she had not expected to have again. A full life, a life with a partner in it. They argued sometimes, not explosively but honestly, about ranch decisions or household matters or the best approach to a difficult correspondence, and they resolved their arguments in the way of two people who respect each other's reasoning, by talking until one or both of them changed their mind or found a third option neither had considered. She liked their arguments almost as much as their agreements, because in both she felt herself fully present, not managed or diminished, simply met. In August she told him she was expecting a child. They were in the study at the time, going over the fall supply orders, and she simply looked up from the ledger and said it. Paul put down his pen. He looked at her with those dark eyes going very still and then very warm. "You are certain?" he asked. "I am certain," she said. He came around the desk and she stood up and he put his arms around her with a careful, enveloping steadiness, and she felt him breathe, a long, slow breath. She could feel his heartbeat. "Good," he said into her hair. "That is very good." Clara was enormously interested in the news. She asked practical questions with her usual thoroughness. When would the baby arrive? Would it sleep in her room? Would it be a boy or a girl? And could she name it? On the last question, Paul said she could make a suggestion. Clara thought about this for several days and announced finally that if it was a boy he should be called James, after her grandfather, and if it was a girl she should be called Rose, because roses were serious flowers. Both of these names were received with solemn consideration. The pregnancy was healthy and uncomplicated. Stella continued managing the household and the accounts through the fall, slowing the physical work as winter approached but maintaining the organizational and correspondence work she had taken on. Paul hired a second ranch hand for the winter, a young man named Ben who was quiet and hardworking, to take on some of the heavier outdoor work that Samuel could not cover alone. The autumn was golden and mild that year. The cattle went into winter in good condition. The root cellar was full. The accounts showed the ranch in better financial shape than it had been in several years, and Paul was negotiating an expansion of the herd for the following spring that would significantly increase the ranch's capacity. He included Stella in every discussion of this negotiation, read her the letters from the cattle broker in Wichita, asked her to draft responses, genuinely wanted her analysis. Emmett Holt, for his part, had not set foot near the Sawyer ranch since March, and the news of Stella's marriage had apparently reached him through the usual channels of community information. Whatever calculations he had been making were clearly revised. He was not, in any case, a man who liked losing, and the fact that the widow he had evicted was now the wife of the most established rancher in the district was a fact that no one who knew Holt would have failed to notice had a particular irony in it. Roy Clement had also, some months earlier, taken himself elsewhere. Word was he had gone to Colorado. No one seemed greatly troubled by this. November came, and with it the first anniversary of that first day of winter when Stella had driven her wagon through the dark toward a light on a low hill. She and Paul did not speak of this anniversary directly, but she thought he was aware of it, because on the evening of the date in question, he came in from the range early and built up the fire in the front room, and they sat together in the warmth, and he took her hand and held it without saying anything for a long, quiet time. She thought about that evening, the deputy with his folded paper, the cold coming on hard, Clara's small hand finding hers in the dark. She thought about the courage it had taken to turn the wagon east toward a stranger's light, and the way that courage had led her here, to this room, to this man, to this life that had grown from a cold winter doorstep into something full and warm and permanent. "I am grateful," she said. "For what particularly?" he asked. "For the fact that you opened the door," she said. He looked at her. "I could not have done otherwise," he said. "When I saw you on the porch," he paused, which was unusual for him. "You were standing so straight," he said. "You had been through the worst kind of day, and you were standing there looking at me like you could handle whatever I said. And Clara was there beside you just as straight," and I thought. He stopped again. "What did you think?" she asked. "I thought that whoever let you get to a stranger's door on a night like that had made a serious mistake," he said, "and that I was not going to make the same one." She leaned against his shoulder. The fire was warm. Outside, the November wind was doing its work on the plains, the same wind that had cut through their coats a year ago on the road, and here it was outside where it belonged. The baby came in March, a fact that seemed to Stella to have a particular rightness, March being the month of new beginnings on the plains. The birth was attended by the local midwife, a capable woman named Agnes, and by Ruth Haverford, who had appointed herself a person of ongoing importance in the Sawyer household, and who proved during the long hours of labor to be steady and practical and very good at keeping both Paul and Clara calm in the next room. It was a boy. Paul held his son for the first time with the same careful, undemonstrative attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, standing in the bedroom with the infant in his arms, and looking at him with an expression so naked in its feeling that Stella, exhausted and luminous with it, felt her throat tighten. "James," Clara said firmly from the doorway, where she had been allowed entrance the moment it was decent. "His name is James, we agreed." "James," Paul said, without looking up from the child. His voice was barely a sound. "James Thomas Sawyer," Stella said. Paul looked at her, and the use of Thomas's name was not a complication but a tribute, a way of holding the whole truth of her life without erasing any part of it, and he understood this immediately. She saw it in his face, the gratitude and the dignity of it. "James Thomas Sawyer," he agreed. Clara came all the way into the room and stood on her toes to look at her brother, and announced that he was very small but appeared to be acceptable. Ruth Haverford, from the doorway, laughed with real warmth. Agnes, the midwife, packed her bag with professional efficiency. Paul sat on the edge of the bed, the baby in one arm, his other hand finding Stella's, and Clara climbed up on Stella's other side with the familiarity of a child in her own home, and that was how the four of them were, in the March bedroom with the light coming in pale and new through the window. Spring came fully then, as spring always does, without negotiation. The prairie went green. The cattle ranged. The calves ran in the fields. Samuel and Ben managed the daily work of the ranch with the efficiency of two men who had found their working rhythm, and Paul oversaw it with the steady attention that was simply his nature. And Stella managed the house and the accounts and the correspondence and fed James and watched Clara ride, and at the end of each day came into the room with her husband and felt the deep-running satisfaction of a life that was genuinely hers. There were still difficulties, because life has them. A hard summer drought 2 years later cost them a portion of the herd and required careful renegotiation of the expansion plan. A legal dispute over a water right on the south boundary kept Paul and the county lawyers occupied for the better part of a winter. Clara, at 9 and 10 and 11, developed the strong opinions and occasional stubbornness that are the natural feature of a girl of her character and intelligence, and navigating these required patience that Paul had and Stella had, and which they sometimes needed to remind each other of. But these were the difficulties of a life being lived, not a life being survived. There was a difference, and Stella knew it in her bones. James grew from an infant into a sturdy, round-cheeked boy who had Paul's dark hair and Stella's gray eyes, and Clara's habit of going very still and serious before doing something completely unexpected. He followed his father around the ranch from the age of 2 with a devotion that was both touching and occasionally inconvenient, appearing underfoot at the barn and the stable and the far pasture with a persistence that suggested he had decided Paul's work was the most interesting thing in his world, and intended to understand all of it as soon as possible. Paul, for his part, bore this with a patience and a pleasure that was transparent to anyone who saw them together. He explained things to James in the serious, complete way he explained things to everyone, and James listened with the focused attention that was, Stella thought, one of the things he had inherited from both his parents. Clara became a rider of real skill by her 10th year, capable of managing most of the horses in the stable, and developing what Samuel called an eye for a good animal that was not common even in experienced riders. She also had Stella's facility with figures, and had been helping with the simpler household accounts since she was 9, which she did with a matter-of-fact efficiency that Paul said, more than once, reminded him very much of her mother. In the fall of 1886, 4 years after Stella had driven her wagon through the dark toward a strange light, the Sawyer ranch completed the largest single cattle sale in its history. Paul came in from Wichita with the signed contracts, and the draft for a sum that represented the culmination of 4 years of methodical expansion, improved management, and the kind of patient long-term thinking that he and Stella had done together over ledger books and correspondence and evening conversations at the kitchen table. He laid the draft on the table in front of her and stood back with his arms folded and looked at her. She looked at the figures. She looked up at him. "We built that," she said. "Yes," he said. "We did." She stood up and kissed him in the kitchen in the middle of the afternoon, and he held her for a long moment with his face in her hair, and when she pulled back his eyes were warm and entirely at peace. That same fall, Stella discovered she was expecting again. She told him in the study as she had told him the first time, and he came around the desk and held her in the same way, with the same long, steady breath. "A brother for James," Clara said when she was told with the confidence of a child who has decided how things should be. "Or a sister," Stella said. Clara considered this. "Also acceptable," she allowed. The second child was born in the spring of 1887, another boy, whom they named Henry after Paul's father, who had died the previous decade in Indiana, and of whom Paul spoke rarely but with a particular quiet respect. Henry was larger than James had been and arrived with considerably more noise, which Paul said was promising, and which Samuel said meant he would be an outdoor man, and which Clara said meant he was going to be loud, which was less desirable but manageable. The house was full now. In a way, It had never been during Paul's years of solitude on the plains. Full of the sound of children and the daily business of a working household, and the sustained, easy companionship of two people who had built something genuine together. Paul sometimes stood in the doorway of the front room in the evenings and looked at the scene within it. Stella at the table with the accounts or a letter, Clara reading by the lamp, James with whatever he was taking apart and examining on the floor, Henry asleep in the cradle by the fire. And his expression in those moments was not dramatic or effusive, but simply settled. The expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was looking for, and found it exactly right. Stella caught him doing this one evening in late autumn, and she set down her pen and looked at him across the room. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He came in from the doorway and sat in the chair across from her. The fire was good, the children were settled, the wind outside was doing its autumn work on the eaves. "I was thinking about that first evening," he said, "when you knocked on the door." "What about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about how close it came to not happening," he said. "If you had turned a different direction, if I had been farther out on the range and not heard the wagon," he looked at her. "I think about that sometimes." "So do I," she said. He paused in that way he had when he was being more careful than usual about words. "I was very alone before you came," he said. "I had made a kind of peace with it because I am not a man who falls apart easily. But this," he looked around the room, at the children and the firelight and the life that filled every corner. "This is better than peace." She got up from the table and came to him, and he moved so she could sit beside him in the wide chair, which had always been large enough for one and managed, with some arrangement, to be adequate for two, and she leaned against him in the warmth. "Yes," she said, "it is better than peace." The years that followed had the quality that good years do. They passed with a richness that is only fully visible in retrospect. The ranch grew. The children grew. Clara, at 16, was running a significant portion of the household accounts on her own, with a confidence and accuracy that made Paul tell her plainly that she was the best bookkeeper in the district, which she received with the dignified satisfaction of someone who has been told something she already knew. James, at 8, could ride as well as some grown men, and had begun, with Paul's patient instruction, to learn the fundamentals of cattle management. Henry was a cheerful, vigorous child of 3, who had not yet found anything in the world that did not interest him, and who showed every sign of maintaining this position indefinitely. Stella turned 37 in the autumn of 1889, and Paul turned 41, and they celebrated with a supper that Ruth Haverford insisted on organizing, and that brought together most of the people who had been part of their years on the plains. Samuel, now gray-haired and slightly slower but no less sharp-minded. Ben, who had married a young woman from Caldwell and had 2 children of his own, Ruth and her husband Frank. Several neighboring families, who had become genuine friends over the years. After the supper, when the guests had gone and the children were in bed, Stella and Paul sat on the porch in the cool October evening with a lamp burning behind them through the window, and the plains were dark and wide under a sky full of stars, the same stars that had been overhead on that first winter night 7 years ago. "I want to tell you something," Stella said. "Yes." He was leaning back in his chair with his coffee, looking at the sky. "I was frightened that first night," she said. "When I knocked on your door, I was more frightened than I showed. I had Clara with me and I had nothing else, and I was standing on a stranger's porch and I did not know if you were a good man." "Were you reassured quickly?" he asked. "Reasonably quickly," she said. "You carried my daughter up the stairs without being asked. That told me something important." He was quiet for a moment. "I was not certain what to do that first evening," he said. "I was not accustomed to women and children in the house. I was afraid of getting it wrong." "You did not get it wrong," she said. "You got it exactly right." He turned to look at her. The lamplight from the window caught the side of his face, the gray at his temples more pronounced now, the lines around his eyes that had deepened over the years of work and weather, the whole face of a man she knew as well as she knew her own. "You saved yourself," he said. You turned the wagon. I only opened the door." "That was enough," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair and held it with the easy, complete certainty of a man who has been doing this for 7 years and intends to continue indefinitely. They sat together in the October night, listening to the plains, and the stars turned slowly overhead the way they always had and always would, indifferent to the small specific warmth of 2 people on a porch in Kansas, which was, Stella thought, exactly as it should be. The indifference of the stars made the warmth more precious, not less. It made it something that had been found and held on to rather than simply given. She had lost Thomas. She had lost her home. She had driven through the dark with her daughter and her hope and her backbone and her $4 in a boot, and she had knocked on a stranger's door, and the stranger had been Paul. And Paul had looked at her on his doorstep, in the cold and the dark and the beginning of winter, and he had said, "Come inside." And she had, and so had Clara, and so had all the years and the life they had built together, the hard years and the good years and the daily years, and all the evenings by the fire with the accounts and the coffee, and the children and the quiet, extraordinary ordinariness of a life that was theirs. The wind moved through the prairie grass in long, sweeping waves in the dark. The horses were settled in the barn. Inside the house, 3 children slept under good wool quilts. The ledger books were in the study, showing a ranch in sound financial health. The correspondence was answered. The accounts were balanced. Paul's hand was warm around hers. "Come inside," he said softly, because the air was growing cold. She looked at him and smiled. "Yes," she said. They went inside together, and the door closed behind them, and the lamp in the window burned warmly against the Kansas night, a light visible on clear evenings for 2 miles in every direction.